boys and girls of all ages. Here I am with my partner, Mike Sauter. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing great. I'm getting out of town for a little while. Nobody, please don't rob my house. My wife and I are going to Savannah, Georgia. All the kids have flown the coop, 4 kids. And this will be our first trial of, just kind of doing a little vacation. We're never going to be snowbirds. I'm a potted plant. I teach a course on Wendell Berry at the college. So rootedness is kind of my thing. But Savannah, Georgia, a little bit of Hilton Head, meeting some in-laws in a part of South Carolina. My oldest daughter's in-laws, will connect with them, people we haven't spent time with since the wedding 3 years ago. So I look forward to the
Okay.
whole thing. Then it's back for Holy Week, right?
That sounds like fun. Actually, it's so nice. This time of year, I start to feel more alive. You ever seen the movie or read the stories of Baron Munchausen?
Yeah, yeah.
It's like how when he's having adventures, he gets younger. That's
Uh-huh.
how I feel at this time of year because I'm out doing more farming stuff and
Yeah,
feel
and a bad weather
slightly
week is all
younger.
the more painful, isn't it? Like when our bodies are saying, "Boy, I'd like to be putting a spade in the dirt," and when you can't do it, I get really, I'm either happy or more antsy.
Yeah, and of course, our guest today is John Milbank, and their seasons are a little bit ahead of ours, even though England is far north of where Michigan and New York are on
Is it all about the
both
jet stream there?
far north. Yeah,
It's
Okay.
entirely about the jet stream. If the jet stream stops, we're in the poles or something. We
yes,
have
that's
polar
right.
bears.
Well,
Yeah.
No,
believe it
it
or
would
not,
be like Newfoundland.
yeah,
It would be all fir trees and stuff like that.
yeah, believe
But
it or not,
Yeah.
Mike.
currents are really, really important. In South America, they have the Humboldt current, which makes the sea cold. So I thought, off the South American coast, it would be fantastic swimming and surfing. It's so cold you can't go in there.
Yeah,
Wow. Wow.
which I
But we've got the opposite effect. We've got a warm current
yeah,
that makes our western coast very significantly warmer to swim in
right.
than the eastern coast.
And I'll never forget
Most all of that is new to me. Yeah.
how surprised I was to find out that Michigan, and I know where you are too, Mike, is basically at the same parallel
Thank
as
you.
Spain,
Yeah. Yeah.
which it's kind of stunning when you think about it.
Hmm.
But anyway, here we are with John Milbank, and
Yeah,
I'm so
very
honored
well.
to have John on the show. Now, unlike John and Mike, I my academic training was not in theology. I'm a, I started off as a musician and poet and became a Waldorf teacher for a while, and so my grounding was always in literature and especially poetry and the plays of William Shakespeare. Now, but then something happened, right? So then when I after being a Waldorf teacher for a while, returned to graduate school to pursue a doctorate in English literature, and I was always interested in religious literature, and I wanted to work on the metaphysical poets in the 17th century. And lo and behold, I found this book, The Suspended Middle
Mm.
by John Milbank, which actually I have to thank you, John, because that that book and your discussion of pure nature in there because it unlocked the door for me.
It's a huge part of your book, The Submerged Reality, Michael.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
submerged reality wouldn't have happened without that my encountering that book. And neither actually would my doctoral dissertation, which was later published as Literature and the Encounter with God in post-Reformation England, because that gave me a vocabulary for it. Because I didn't, like I said, I didn't have this grounding in historical theology until John introduced me to it, and then afterwards, I was so honored that my publisher sent a manuscript copy of the Submerged Reality to John, who wrote a very generous jacket uh,
Dust
endorsement.
jacket blurb. Yeah.
And such an honor. And John has been so generous to me and kind to me ever since. And I'm so thankful and honored to be able to invite him to the program. And I'm so mad, well, in a way, that back in September, John and I were both invited to a conference at Cambridge for the Institute of Orthodox Christian Studies. They had a conference on Pavel Florensky, and I was finally so looking forward to going there and being able to spend some time with John in the flesh. But my mother was getting increasingly sick, and she died 6 weeks after that. So I was not able to attend in person, but I did it online, which was I was thankful for that, and I was thankful to hear John's words of wisdom in there, and it's always a treat to listen to John Milbank talk about anything because his interests are so wide ranging and uh, he's so insightful, and he's the kind of person. This is what I love about radical orthodoxy in general, but John in particular, is that he has this gift for a kind of acuity that cuts through received opinion and looks at what is actually there. And for me, that's very inspiring. And so, thank you to the program here, John Milbank.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Michael. And all that's reciprocated, of course. Absolutely.
So here today we're going to talk about, amongst other things, but our starting off point will be this notion that I think encountered in John's dialogue with Slavoj Žižek, which it's called in the book. What's it called? The Monstrosity of Christ. And in there, John drops a hint, just a hint, about this notion of an alternative or alternate modernity. So, John, I wonder if you could tell our listeners what you mean by that term.
Well, I think broadly what I mean is that there's one model that says everything's gone wrong since the Middle Ages or the middle of the Middle Ages or something like that. And ever since that time, we've been concerned only with humanism or with naturalism. We've left God out of the picture. And then there's another model that says, well, thank goodness for that. We now live in an immanent reality, or an immanent frame, as Charles Taylor calls it. And what we share in common is humanity and nature. And we can leave religion out of the picture. That's fine for private life. You can be in touch with God if you like. And I think that we very much need a third picture. And by that, I mean that I think we can't escape the fact that in modern times, we've become more and more aware of the mystery of our human existence, the mystery of the self, the creative capacities of the self. And at the same time, we've become more and more aware of the mysteries of nature and our ability to explore the mysteries of nature and the dynamic forces within nature. And if you like, the power of human beings to change reality and the way in which nature is itself changing. And in terms of evolution, we live within the changeability of nature. But to grossly simplify, I think this has left us with a problem of trying to coordinate the human and the natural, or the human spirit and subjectivity with natural forces, and how these cohere together without some kind of implausible dualism on the one hand, or some sort of reductionism on the other hand, or thirdly, a kind of voluntarism, is something that secular reality has never been able to explain.
Right.
And I think in the face of that, it's incredibly tempting. And it's tempting to a lot of young men in suits who wear ties and like kind of older kind of boomers like all of us,
Right.
It's very tempting to say, well, let's go back to pre-modernity. Let's forget about all this change stuff. Let's get back to a sort of very fixed order of essences and the way, God created things, and all this alterability stuff is very, very dangerous. And I think this is to kind of stick your head in the sand. I think for one thing, it is to ignore the fact that a greater awareness of humanity and nature was already there in the Middle Ages. It was already there in the 12th century. You could even say that it sort of begins with Socrates, if you like, and that indeed part and parcel of a recognition of transcendence, of something beyond the cosmos, is a sense of the independence of nature and the independence of human beings, and the way in which human beings at the summit of nature, transcending nature, are also in touch with something beyond nature. So if you put it in these terms, kind of awareness of nature and something like a turn to the human subject has been part and parcel of our very commitment to transcendence all along. And I think the kind of the new thing that happens in the period that we sort of broadly call the Renaissance is this far greater sense of mutability, really. And that everything is in flux, and that there are powerful forces that can change things. And I think that often in the face of this, you get something like a condemnation of Prometheanism, a condemnation of Titanism. And this is a very important theme in Balthasar's work. And I suspect that Balthasar never really resolved his contradictions in the face of his attitudes towards both the Renaissance and towards German Romanticism. But I think it's far too easy to talk about, a dangerous Prometheanism. And in actual fact, I would want to argue that paradoxically, it's the people who are looking for a new kind of stability in the subject, a stability in epistemology, who are much more in danger of this. So that if you think that there's some kind of a priori rationality whereby we can control nature, and this sort of belongs to a picture whereby you start to have an ontology independent of God. And then because ontology means that which we can sort of fully understand, that flips over into being epistemology. And so it's in this model of the subject confronting nature and the two being in a kind of unexplained correlation that in fact you get this enterprise of controlling. So what I want to argue against that is that it's actually possible to have a dynamic view that is sustaining the older sense that we are participating in the absolute or in God. In other words, the idea that everything has become fluid and dynamic doesn't necessarily deny that the older participatory vision. And indeed, once more, you could say there are anticipations of that in the older vision, that Plato more than Aristotle thinks that everything is moving, everything is temporal. Augustine intensifies that sense of temporal motion. And then I think part of the trick, if you sort of hang on to this sense that although everything is dynamic and changing, everything is creative, is to link nature and the human. In other words, you don't have a duality, precisely because nature is creating itself because it's created by God. You know, what does God, the creator part, what does he give to the creation? Only himself. So what he gives is the power to create.
Right.
So that this is, nature is creative, and it comes to the head in human beings who are most of all poets. That's what they mostly are. That because they then consciously create. Although the whole question of how we relate to the unconscious forces in nature is all important. So I think that when I say alternative modernity, I don't just mean a sort of modernity we should have had but didn't have. Because although you could say, yeah, kind of the main report of modernity is bad, it's too technological, it's too much a dualism of humans and nature, and humans controlling nature. Nevertheless, the alternative modernity was always there. So it's there in somebody like Nicholas of Cusa. It's there in Vico. It's there even to some extent in Leibniz. And and here I'm very indebted to Michael. I think he's completely right to start talking again about the esoteric tradition and the so-called occult tradition. That Neoplatonism and Hermeticism never went away. They continued to be part of the scientific debate, even in the 18th century. You can argue that in the period of Leibniz, there's a sort of coming back of the Renaissance. The 18th century science is very vitalist. And then you get the discovery of electricity, electromagnetism, galvanism, and you start reading the world in terms of chemistry rather than physics. And this has got to do with the survival of alchemical traditions. You know, we keep on discovering that this is more mainline than we think, that people like Schelling and Hegel know this stuff. It's important to them. Jakob Boehme is important to them.
Very important.
Even if he may be in some ways a problematic version of this. And by the way, it's interesting that Schelling finally accuses Hegel of being too Behmenistic.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, it's true. I mean, I think without... No.
Despite the fact that it's true of both of them. But Schelling has this wonderful remark where he says, well, you can forgive Jakob Boehme because he was genuinely drunk. Hegel's only pretending.
That's great.
That's true.
It's such a terrible put down. But so we now realize that the Romantic movement, and even in England, people like Sir Humphrey Davy, it was primarily about what we now call science. It wasn't just all arty. It was very much to do with the implications of electricity, the new chemistry, and so forth. And this gave rise to it revived a much more philosophical understanding of nature and an attempt to sort of fuse again physics with philosophy,
right?
Which you can think of as being more Platonic. You know, it's only in Aristotle that we have a separate book called Physics and then a book called Metaphysics.
Yeah, and there's a sense in which you point to something important with Boehme in particular, because he comes in and he behaves like an enzyme, like a ferment, which especially in Germany, which doesn't change everybody entirely to Behmenists, but he provides I don't know if it's permission or he allows an insight, and you see this in the German Romantics like Novalis in particular, but you see it in Goethe, right? And Goethe had this incredible influence on Wordsworth, and where
Yes.
Goethe, not only the poet, but Goethe the scientist, right? How
Yes.
do we look at
Yeah.
nature, right? That's the question that comes up
Yeah.
there, and I think it's an important and often ignored aspect of uh, the time since.
I think so, and I think Goethe has this sense that, look, because we're part of nature, um, what is inside us is inside nature. So don't we know nature from inside?
Hmm.
Rather than this idea that we're going to know nature by, just closely observing
Yeah,
it. That's only part of the picture.
yeah. He anticipates David Bohm, doesn't he?
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. And there's so much that is anticipated in these people. But I think so by alternative modernity, I think I mean very much that you need a metaphysics of creativity, and that our creativity we can only make sense of if we see it as a participation in the absolute, or in God, who is himself creative, and both externally and internally creative, which is why all these people are so obsessed with the Trinity, from Nicholas of Cusa through to Schelling, through to Coleridge in England.
Yeah.
This is absolutely crucial for them, and it's the opposite of deism. I mean, Jacob Boehme would be another example, that we can only talk about God if we understand him as, not somehow beyond the contrast between rest and motion, beyond the contrast between being and becoming. Yeah. That in some way he brings himself about, but not in a kind of metaphysical causa sui way that would make a mistake, but in a sense that's not interfering with the divine simplicity, but that nonetheless is more radical than simply thinking about God as perfect act, without sort of denying God as perfect act. You start to think, well, what else does that imply? If all our categories are finite categories, including the contrast between act and potential and so forth.
I think a lot of your work, John, too, you were talking about beyond the contrast.
Yeah.
Another seminal one for you is beyond the contrast of individual and society, right?
Yes.
And that's where I was thinking of. I put your name in Google this morning with this Robert Colosso, where he too would almost say, society. You both use the words society in such a powerful way. And there's a frequent guest on our show, and we'd have to have the two of you on sometime, because his name is Guido Preparata, and he was at the Gregorian, but he's a sociologist who comes up to the same place you are, but it's almost using sociology to critique sociology. So he'll prove with other sociologists that atomic individualism, that anthropology or that view of society cannot get at things like, in his case, they were real scientists, the obesity crisis, the AIDS epidemic. And they're showing where that model that you so brilliantly critique of society and sociology, that it's insufficient even on its own terms, But you've blown me away a couple. I want to say that the people who are bothered by the ultra ability stuff, it's just such a funny way of phrasing that for me. I'm going to steal that. We're always talking about the rad trads, the ortho bros, but you gave us another way of saying the same, bothered by the ultra ability stuff. And also, just a curious question for me is your difference with von Balthasar. I'm not a von Balthasar scholar. I've read a lot, but and I know you're onto something. Where would I go as an interested person on his kind of attack on the dangers of Prometheanism?
Unfortunately, his Apocalypse of the German Soul has not
Okay.
been
It hasn't been
translated. And I
translated.
think
Yes.
it's probably the key to Balzac. That's his first blockbuster before he writes the other blockbusters. And so we don't have that. But I think that Cyril O'Regan in English, I think Cyril O'Regan in his work on Balthasar is absolutely right to somehow suggest that Balthasar is, in a way, quite tortured by the question of the relationship of orthodoxy to Neoplatonism, to Gnosticism, to Hermeticism, to apocalyptic. So and he loves Goethe, but he's troubled by Goethe.
It's so fascinating what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. And I probably think that in relation to Balthasar, I'm a bit more prepared to go on the wild side.
Yeah. One more thing with that. Then, when you're talking about the the dynamism, there's a reticence to embrace the dynamic. Could that be equated in our own American land with what William James was talking about, the multiverse and the universe? Do you think there's something there that I'm a big fan of John Cowper Powys, and he
me too. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. And when he, for him at the end of his life, he was a brilliant, I think, religious thinker, but he was just globbing onto the multiverse. I'm always trying to wrap my head around that. And I felt some similarities when you were talking about this lack of comfort with the dynamic.
Yes. No, that could well be. What would it mean to say there were many worlds? I don't know. Mustn't they be? Maybe it's a bit like society and the individual. They have to be connected. Relationality is more fundamental.
And Michael would find this interesting too, because Michael, you're interested, or common interest, in Berdyaev. You're talking, John, about creativity as seminal. Yeah. Powys finds in Berdyaev a closed universe. He says he points to creativity, and then he kind of walls it off. And this is all kind of above my head, but I'm still thinking.
Yes.
Something here about what you're saying is a dynamic universe. Michael.
Yeah. Well, I think all the Russians, and probably Berdyaev's not my favorite Russian, but I think all of the kind of the sociologists following on Soloviev are. Really, it's a very long footnote to German Romanticism. And Schelling in particular is absolutely at the center of that story, and it's in a way perhaps an attempt to have a more orthodox version of that German legacy, as I think Balthasar himself recognizes, but very much the same problems are arising. Again, it's this question of an immanent creativity. It's a question of the relationship between the one and the all. And, so above all, it's always a question of how does the one become many? How is it that God, if he is all in all, if he's absolute, how does he generate something besides himself? And I think that the Russians are very much echoing Schelling in suggesting that, if God is real, then what is truth other than some sort of echoing of the process by which God is in himself and brings about the universe? It can't, truth can't just be a matter of a passive, alienated looking at things. It has to be, so that I think that people like Andrei Bailey and these people in the Russian Silver Age are still sort of echoing this basically German Romantic view that sort of philosophy and poetry are two sides of really the same thing.
Absolutely.
The philosopher is trying to understand everything in his subjectivity, and the poet or the artist is trying to bring that about in an object. It's trying to show the infinite in something finite,
Right.
you know. And for all these people, I think, and this is the kind of thing that, you know, sort of half fascinates, half worries Balthasar. For all of these people, this is an eschatological process. And ultimately, it's rooted, and in Schelling, this is massively clear, in a kind of alchemical legacy, and this link of alchemy and Chiliasm that you had back in England in the 17th century.
Right.
It's still powerfully protected, so that, you know, you are trying to transform reality. You are trying through art to beautify the world, and that is the same process by which you're trying to divinize yourself. You know, that you're trying to leave the world and yet at the same time transfigure the world. You know, I mean, you can see it in Tarkovsky's film André Rubio. I mean, this is not to be read. It's naive to read it as simply traditional Orthodox piety. It's not. It's absolutely suffused with this Russian variant of romanticism. You know, there is a deep blending of things that you can see as perfectly orthodoxly Christian, and yet also things that are usually categorized as esoteric.
You are so fascinating. You're so fascinating. Yeah.
Well, I think what you're saying, John, and I think this is important. With you would have, I think what you're describing is that this kind of worldview, you know, is grounded in revelation, right? Which
Absolutely.
is art and science should be revelation.
Yeah.
Not control. You know, the other thing that we see right now, right? This
everything is a revelation, and you know, what we call revelation is a sort of coming to ahead of that. So you know, it's a revelation of revelation, perhaps. Yeah. And I think you know, I think we can only now have this kind of sort of poetic metaphysics, if you like.
That's my thought too. Yeah.
And the other stuff is just not going to work. You know? This very sort of rationalistic approach that in the end is sort of an attempt to go back to Volf or something, you know.
As it collapses, right?
Yeah, I think so.
So where do you
I mean, this is where I mean, I'm trying to sort of read Schelling at the moment. What I find so fascinating is the way he talks about the positive, and it's kind of can be almost shocking. He'll say, you know, it's not enough just to talk about God in negative terms. You've actually somehow got to begin with the divine viewpoint. And your first reaction is to say, oh no, that can't be the case. But what he means by this is that, like, even negative theology, if you take it too abstractly, you're divorcing it from mysticism. You know, negative theology only works because in some sense you are saying you are in touch with God. You're negating all these reasons.
That's necessary insight.
Some level of positive intuition. And after all, you know, Dionysius, the Areopagite, says the mystical is beyond the negative and the positive. It's a negation of the negation.
Right.
I'm going to write a book called Negative Theology.
Yeah. And I think, you know, the question with Schelling, but with sort of romanticism in general, is often so, well, is this too much like a kind of arrogant gnosis? And this would be Balthasar's worry.
That's his concern.
And is he sort of underplaying faith? But on the other hand, Schelling is sort of worried that faith will be something abstract, too fideistic, not mystical enough. And as I say, I'm still trying to work this stuff out, but the incredible thing is that Schelling, I mean, he kind of rather fell out with people like Jacobi, but he knew Eschenmayer. Eschenmayer, who was close to Jacobi, is a huge friend. So they actually have this debate and this kind of interaction going on, which involves also this very complicated debate about nature and the relation to subjectivity, and whether Schelling thinks of subjectivity ultimately into unconscious way that can then sort of turn into sort of Zizek type materialism, right, and so forth, you know. But I think that, you know, it's very important to read this stuff and to realize that kind of probably the Romantic epoch, and I would add to this, you know, French Romanticism as well, especially made de Biron and the current that becomes French spiritualism, and eventually through Ravissant, Schelling, and the sort of tie-up between Schelling and Ravissant. But I think we're going to have to reckon more and more with the, you know, the complexity of this period. And I think one thing that is sort of embarrassing from a Catholic point of view is that it's very clear that particularly the German Romantics, the people coming out of the Tübingen school, were completely ill at ease with the way Catholicism went. So they didn't like papal infallibility. They didn't like the declaration of the Immaculate Conception, because they thought that this would look like a misunderstanding of the way dogmas emerge to Protestants.
Even with the dogma of the transubstantiation, right? That also it's trying to turn into science, right?
And I mean, it depends, you know, the way you understand transubstantiation. But I think that, you know, there are difficult questions for whether, you know, the Catholic Church somehow bought too much into neo-scholasticism, which is an inherently incredibly modern model that's too much linked to epistemology and positivism and so on. And the problem is that some of the actual doctrinal moves it's made compromise it, I think, which doesn't mean that you can't sort of think out of it as this. Right. And I think, and you know, and I think that, you know, there are a lot of people in France and Italy and so on who are thinking outside this. But I think that they kind of more and more realize that it is this spirit of romanticism that you are essentially reviving, you know, that, or in a sense, everything had already happened before the 20th century. You know, now we're in another century. I think we're realizing this. Like the Nouvelle Theology is deeply, deeply embedded in French Romanticism and Biron, Ravissant, Blondel, Bergson, etc. It's profoundly embedded in that, and then kind of Russian sophiology is profoundly embedded in the 19th century sort of Silver Age symbolist reworking of that, you know. So, and I think what we're now seeing in theology is that it's parallel to the return to metaphysics in the secular world with speculative realism and all that, and Schelling, often the linking point. What we're now seeing is a kind of break with the model of kind of no metaphysics, and then some sort of fideism. So so like Heidegger plus Barth, or Wittgenstein plus Barth.
Right.
You know, that in a way dominated 20th century theology. No. And if you look at what people are now interested in, it's terribly clear that as there's a sort of return to this kind of romantic metaphysics.
No, this is actually something I've been thinking about a lot lately. So I spent much of my career as a professor teaching students how to write, and so I often have students who are not necessarily English majors my courses, you know, like they're psychology majors. And I say, I always tell them, isn't that the worst stuff to read in the world? Is contemporary psychology? And then you look at the history of psychology. You even go back to Freud, go to Freud, Jung,
Yeah.
that first half of the 20th century. And they were such great writers, and they were so imbued with romanticism. And you also see this
Yeah.
in the, the Brothers Grimm and all the people who were
Oh yes,
who
yes.
were who were collating all the folk stories and folk
There are
songs.
so many Clemens, Brentano, and all
Yes,
these people. Yeah.
and
Oh, no, it's
and
astonishing how much of this.
bring it back. You know?
I know. Well,
Yeah.
I agree. Just as I tend to think, it's a pity that kind of Art Nouveau didn't carry on, and we got
Mhm.
kind of modernists. I love stuff like Gaudi and people like that. And I think you're precisely right about psychology, that we still lack work that would really do a sort of genealogy of modern psychology and psychoanalysis. That again, these ideas about the unconscious are coming from the Romantics.
Exactly.
They often have a religious background. They often the question of our relationship to nature is very, very, very important. The unconscious is really quite close to the divine, and obviously somebody like Jung echoes this. But I have to say, for my taste, not in a very successful way, but it's too skeptical at some level, I think. But undoubtedly, so that the as a pupil of mine once said to me, the incoherence of psychoanalysis is it's trying to heal the soul without believing in the soul,
Right.
or the
But it was
incoherence of a lot of therapy. But then if you look back at the discourses that tried to understand the relationship of the soul to body and the soul to nature, stretching back to Robert Burton again, we're looking at things that we would often call esoteric.
absolutely. And I think what you see
And it's
with
occultism that's
is
pre-generating these things.
so what we see with that though is psychology and psychoanalysis in the early days was an interpretive art. And now it's become a prescriptive one, including prescriptions, right?
Yeah.
So and you saw the same thing over the course of the 20th century in literary studies, where and you see this still in universities. There's a residue of it in universities,
And there's
where they try to
appalling
turn everything into science, right?
Yeah, and perfectly respectable people who would never commit crimes, or at least not ones that you're going to be arrested for, say things like, well, I'm not here to give you moral prescriptions, I don't make judgments. Well, so what kind of advice is it, if we're talking about human behavior and flourishing, that isn't ethical advice?
Yeah.
It can only be bad advice.
100%.
And of course they get paid for it. Can you imagine what
handsomely.
What would Socrates have said?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings up too, Dr. Milbank, is the genesis of so much of your work. The aporia with individual and society we mentioned, but also this alternative modernity involves your foregrounding the work of church, as an alternate. Could you describe that for people who don't know your work so well?
Yes. Well, I think that we're only because we've got the idea of the church have we sort of radically qualified the place of the political. That you could say that in the antique world, the political was the bounds of the ethical, and it perfectly rightly, the ethical is ultimately about achieving a harmony. But both for the Old Testament and for the Hebrew Bible and the classical world, that meant ultimately a sort of legal practice and a political practice and a coercive practice and a practice that sort of stopped with judgment. But the idea that there is a kind of anarchic polity that was never ever begun because it's rooted in eternity, and it is it's echoing the incarnation and the expression of the Father in the Son, and it's a completely personal and relational order, and it's more fundamental than the political state, and it's international, and it's about reconciliation and the exchange of gifts and the searching for not just a live and let live, but a real loving community. That this is what the church is. And Augustine is very clear. Some people who think they're in the church aren't, and other people who don't know they are. Yeah. And I think one needs to interpret that in the most radical and generous way possible to understand that the church, at once is something real and embodied in ritual, more primarily than institutional, but also institutional forms. And yet it's something that extends beyond that. Not just that it's kind of invisible, but that it's more concrete manifestations have not been recognized. And I think Tom Holland is completely right to suggest that once you kind of release this idea of the primacy of love and forgiveness in the world, you can't stop its kind of cascading echo, and it goes on cascading even through secular society, and in some ways its implications are more followed through by people outside the church than obviously by Christians. Once you've said, well, love is all you need, how do you say that? How would you get that song unless as a Christian outcome? I mean, you can come back and say, well, actually, that might be forgetting something that the Jews rightly knew about. And that might be a needed correction. But all the same, it's clear that it's coming, I think, from this kind of cascading effect. And I do think that it's the church space that has given rise to this sense of the primacy of the social space. Right. And then so another bad aspect of the modernity that we actually have is that the political and the economic are seen as more important. So making money and pursuing power are seen as more fundamental than associating.
Right.
Despite the fact that it's only associating, paradoxically, it's only associating that keeps order. You can have all the constitutions and the guarantees in the world, but in the end, it's only relating, it's only the checks we have on each other and the checks that one country has on another country through a kind of federation. It's actually only society that keeps order.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's fascinating, and I think one of the things I think where feminism went off the rails is it became about money and power and not about ontology. But so what I wanted to ask you now is, I think a really important essay of yours, at least to me, is your essay on sociology and theurgy, which I tried to get permission to republish.
A turning point for me. Yeah.
I tried to get permission to republish it from, I think it was Ashgate who published it, and they were my publisher at the time. And
they said that would be £1 million or something.
That's about what they charged, yeah.
$1 million. Yeah.
They were nuts, yeah. So, but that's an important essay, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of sociology, or Sophia, in this alternate modernity we've been discussing, because I think it's such central to that essay, and I think a curative thing for our society now.
Yeah, well, I suppose you know, Sophia in one respect, and it's of course it's all in the Bible, by the way.
I
To
know. We're not
all you
heretics.
all you Protestants in Middle America, you know, just explain it. It is actually in the Bible.
Save your comments, folks. Read the good book.
Just read the good book. It's all there. And you know, it's the immanence of God in the world, and it's significantly characterized as a female presence. So it's a kind of a curious sort of passive receptivity, passive activity, if you like. It's a receptivity that is also active. And so the fact that it's cast as a kind of female creativity, I think, is very important. But then, you know, as the Russians insist, I mean, this immanence of God really is God. So, you know, it really is the divine essence. And it is also something that's somehow at once objective and subjective. I think you know, there's an ancient debate, you know, there are three persons in the Trinity and one essence, and sort of, is the essence impersonal? Well, no, I think it's a kind of personifying power. It is Sophia. It is yeah, it's a kind of shared objectivity that is nonetheless not impersonal. And so in some sense, it is also a kind of shared personality, I think, for the way that the sociologists are thinking. So there's a sense of the way you're kind of mediating between essence and persons, and the way in relation to Christ that you're mediating between his two natures and one person, so that often you'll find the Russians talk about the human nature of Christ as also Sophia. So in a way, he's sort of bringing together the two Sophias, and this is why the natures are at once separate and yet you know, fused. There's some kind of mysterious change of attributes going on.
And it disrupts categories, right?
That's also why I think the it's partly for that reason that, you know, you've got this sort of immanence of Sophia that is eternal, and therefore this is kind of where it gets controversial, that, you know, it becomes impossible or impiously abstract to sort of say you could have God without his creation, because, you know, if God simply is the God who creates, then God is the God. You know, the essence of God is also the immanence of the world. And if God lacks nothing in himself, then he doesn't even lack generosity in himself. So this is where I would want to be bold, and I would want to suggest that 1,000 sermons about God's, you know, remarkable generosity in giving something that he doesn't need, but he gives to us. I think this is incredibly superficial. It's a failure to really think either theologically or philosophical, because God can't lack anything in himself. If God brings about the finite, then this is in some sense what God is. You know, that this is why Arugula is right to talk about created God. There must be something that God realizes for himself in bringing about creation, because there isn't anything outside God. Yet there is no relationality or generosity or whatever lacking to God. So it must be, and already Gregory of Nyssa intimates this, and Eriugena says it more strongly, that there must be some inherent good to finitude. There must be, and this is where it becomes paradoxical and impossible to think about. Finitude adds nothing to infinitude, and yet apparently it does. There must be some inherent good about limitation, as my friend Peter Larkin, the poet, says. There must be.
I think that's Coventry Patmore's.
Otherwise, Coventry Patmore. Absolutely.
That's his main thing. Yeah.
That is so. You'd forgotten that, but you are absolutely right about that.
That's his main theme. His main theme.
It's like it's kind of this sort of radical kenosis. And,
totally.
So it's just, and after all, again, for the guys out there, Bible Christians out there on the plains, I mean, how else do you make sense of the doctrine of atonement? That an orthodox doctrine of atonement is not just God being nice. God can't lose his own glory. So evil is a contradiction for God. So the restoration of the world, what I'm talking about is this kind of alchemical healing that matters to God. It's crucial, and this is why we're seeing, the manifestation in the incarnation of this kind of both at once. The natures are separate and yet they're joined. So another thing that is very crucial for the Russians, and what I would see as this sort of more radical version of orthodoxy that is part of this new modernity that we need, is the insistence on the eternity of the incarnation. So the incarnation happens in time, but it also discloses something that is eternally true. Yeah. Because that has to be the case if God is simple. And if Christ is God, there is no change that happens to God. So even though this somehow happens once in time, it has to be eternally the case, and therefore you can flip it round. And I also think so. At that point, you could also say that ultimately, we see that the creation is not other to God. We see that in the incarnation, so I agree with Daniel Jordan Wood about this, and he's right to read Maximus that way. There is an implied identity of incarnation and creation. It's impossible to read him any other way, and although this sounds kind of speculative, and although one is saying, in effect, God is able, the incarnation happens, yes, to redeem the world, but it only happens because God is incarnate, because that is an eternal fact in excess of its occasion. And even actually Aquinas says that. So that I think that what we get to at that point is the way in which the Russians, from Soloviev onwards, sort of integrate this theme of the eternal divine humanity that, frankly, they've got from Swedenborg. I mean, so that, Soloviev sat reading Maximus and Swedenborg alongside each other in the British Museum, probably quite close to where Karl Marx was adding another footnote to Schelling,
and then Sophia appears to him, right?
In a nearby desk, and I'm sure Sophia appeared to both of them, but Karl Marx may not notice. But So this sense of, and it's like you get in William Blake, the eternal human form divine,
right,
that he does in those kind of glorious pictures. And although that sounds speculative, and you know, I'm hoping my friend David Bentley Hart will agree here. I'm pretty sure he will. It fits actually better with the ambiguity of a lot of the terminology in the New Testament. So it's not wrong to parse this in terms of the pre-existence of the Logos and so on, but actually it doesn't manifestly make those distinctions. You know, it sounds as if it could also be talking about a pre-existent humanity, and that, you know, the Son of Man, the Son of God, right. These are eternal figures, just as the Logos is an eternal. So there is a kind of eternal creation, and that doesn't mean the creation is equally. It is radically contingent, and yet, you know, God is the loving God who has created. God, the God who, the Father who comes out of himself into the reality of the Son, out of this unfathomable unconsciousness that only is the Father in bringing about the Son, is the same God who has brought about creation. And, you know, creation in God is the Son, and the return of creation in God is the Holy Spirit, or inversely, you know, the Logos for us is the man God, in whom we are all ultimately, you know, included, you know.
Right. This is why.
And if people start to say pantheism and pantheism, absolutely don't care, because, you know, those words are just an excuse for not actually thinking.
This is what it is to be both radical and orthodox. And I think that's so helpful, and it's so refreshing to hear. Anytime I hear you speak, John, it's always refreshing.
For sure. Wow.
Because it's inspiring, and it's clear. You know, in many things you say, you know, I remember when I read the suspended middle. I'm like, why did I realize this before?
Well, I was like that when I read initially de Lubac and Balthasar myself, but the penny clicked. But carry on.
Yeah. So, to start winding up a little, I think what I'd like to ask you, John, is where do you see the alternate modernity now? Where is evidence of that now? So we've done a kind of historical survey of it. Where is it now?
Well, maybe with you on your farm, Michael. You know, I think it's not very, or something like Paul Kingsnorth in Ireland. I think it's not very clearly a manifest except amongst the minority. But I think our concern with the relationship to the natural world is absolutely crucial. So when I talk about, you know, the reinterest in the Romantics, or looking again at the American Transcendentalists or something like that, you know, it's clear that, you know, our concerns about nature are absolutely at the center of that. You know, and that's been going on, if you like, through the 60s. It's maybe the more interesting bit of the 60s legacy. And so I think people thinking seriously about that, and if you like to oversimplify once again and divide things into three once again, I think on the one hand, you've got sort of techno-populists, maybe people like Trump, who hope there's going to be some kind of technical fix. And on the other hand, you've got kind of the green control freaks who think that, you know, some kind of central plan whereby most of us have to kind of save energy and live totally miserable lives while they live in super luxury. And in general, we'll all be controlled by surveillance, and all jobs will be done by robots, and nobody will mind because, you know, zoned out watching endless screens. So there are those people. And then there are people who think, well...
Please tell me there's a third. Please tell me there's a third.
Yeah, I'm hoping there's a third. I'm desperately trying to think about that. But, you know, the third will be people who say, well, you know, actually, it really is a spiritual crisis. There isn't a technical solution, either of the first kind or of the second kind. There isn't simply a technical solution. On the contrary, what we need to do is have a totally different relationship to nature and to technology. So unless we start to see nature as sacred, unless we think of our technical implements as kind of embedded in liturgy, as art and liturgy, as sort of enabling our human creative expressiveness, and as opening up a vision of the transcendent. You know, think of a medieval Gothic cathedral, or for that matter, of a mosque, or of Buddhist temples. I mean, you incredible technical ingenuity, but actually fused with this sense of the theurgic.
Right. Yeah, and there was a moment where the internet, for instance,
we need
that,
theurgic
right?
technology. That will be it. And then we need to discover that we are the priests of nature. Nature is the divine poem. We're supposed to be bringing it to perfection. We're ultimately striving to recover our, like Emerson, you know, our lost paradisal relationship to nature, where somehow we ourselves bring nature about. Nature flows out through us, you know, as you find in Erugena. And of course, that would be the eschaton. But, you know, this is maybe where I'm a bit different from Balthasar. You know, is history just irrelevant? Or is there some sense in which truly our working is helping to bring about the end? You know, this is the kind of the more Russian stress.
Yeah, that's where I am. Yeah, that's our participation in that. I mean, I think, you know,
it's
true that the eschaton is always already happening.
Yeah, we're anticipating and participating in it, and despite the fact that we're screwing up somehow, we're not.
Right?
We've got to have faith that we're not. The infallibility not of the Pope but of the human race.
Right, and if our consciousness is bent toward that participation in the sacred, that has one effect. If our consciousness is focused on a participation in the technocracy, we have a quite different result, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
and just a matter, and that's just a matter of, I think, a transfiguration of thinking in a way.
Yeah, it's a good phrase.
All right. Well, John, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such a delight for me.
Really, really true. Yeah.
And
no,
we hope
it's
to
been
see
very
you
enjoyable.
again. It would be
wonderful. Absolutely.
And give my best to Allison.
I will do, yes.
And tell her I'm gonna come after her to interview her as well, because I've been thinking about it for a bit.
You should. Okay.
We should. All right. Thanks a lot, John Milbank.
Thanks both of you. Thank you, Michael and Michael.
Take care now. And thanks everybody for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. See you next time.